welcome to this Honorary Doctorate Award Lecture of 2022. My name is Susanne Alto. I'm a professor of radio astronomy, and I'm also the head of the Faculty Senate. And it's the faculty that appoint they nominate the honorary doctors, and it's the Faculty Senate who appoint them. And it's my very great pleasure to today present our award winner, Professor Saras Sarasvathy, from University of Virginia. And I'm so excited to hear your lecture. I'm really looking forward to that because you're going to teach me something I know absolutely nothing about, entrepreneurship. I don't think we can sell galaxies yet, but maybe we can figure it out.
I suspect we can sell futures in galaxies.
Let's do go. But before we hear Saras, I'm going to hand over to Professor Henrik Berglund, who will give us an introduction.
Thank you. So you want to stand beside me while I talk as well?
Yes, this is the first time I've ever been on like a...
So I must say I'm very, very happy to introduce Saras as an honorary doctor here at Chalmers. I'm very happy to introduce Saras as an honorary doctor here at Chalmers. We've known each other for quite some time. I remember the first time we met, I think, was in 2002. Saras had just published her, seminal is an overused word, but what turned out to be a very seminal paper in Academy of Management Review introducing the theory of effectuation, which we will hear a little bit more about, I think, in a while. And she was presenting it in Jönköping, which was really a center for entrepreneurship in these days, entrepreneurship research. So I borrowed my brother's Volvo 242 and drove down there to attend the seminar. And it was a great seminar, and we've kept in touch since. And Saras was a Jubilee professor here in 2015, which allowed the relationships not only with me, but with Chalmers in general to deepen even more. And I would say, in addition to influencing me, my research and my teaching, she's been quite instrumental in the pedagogy and the things taught at the School of Entrepreneurship, and also now in the Tracks Initiative, which is rolling out across Chalmers. And I actually, at this time and at this university and with this topic, I cannot think of anyone more deserving and more appropriate as an honorary PhD here at Chalmers in entrepreneurship. So with that, I hand it over to Saras, and I also look forward to listening to Saras, even though I think I know what you're going to say.
Thank you so much, Henrik. I think if I falter for words, I will just call on you and you can present as well. So it's wonderful. One of the best things about being in academia is to have friends that continue and where you can have work relationships as well as relationships that are a little bit more than work, life relationships. I still remember the schnapps with Mats. So there are lots of lovely memories here in Chalmers, and very grateful to be here and learning more as we go along. So when we think about this world that we live in, right? And when we think about forces that shape this world, we might think of things like democracy and science. Or we might also think about economists like Adam Smith or Karl Marx. But have you ever thought of the role of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship in shaping this world in which we live in? So let's take an example of one of the major discoveries in science, right? Think about Charles Darwin going on the voyage of the Beagle, collecting specimens from the Galapagos Islands, based on which he came up with the theory of evolution. Have you ever considered how was he able to get on that voyage of the Beagle? It turns out that his grandfather was Josiah Wedgwood, 18th century entrepreneur, who built a brand that exists even today. He also built a large fortune. He built roads and canals, worked with scientists, philosophers, and politicians, and the whole idea of the Wedgwood brand embodied democracy, right? So the Wedgwood brand was the idea that you don't have to die in the class in which you are born. you can own the same vase and the same set of plates that the Duchess owns, right? So common people could do that. So it's literally the shaping of democracy and science through entrepreneurship that inspires me and inspires colleagues who teach entrepreneurship today. Similar to this story is my own story growing up in India. The inspiring things that we were taught as we were growing up were stories of people like Mahatma Gandhi, as you can imagine. But it was only when I was wanting to go to college that I began to understand the role of entrepreneurship in the history of India, Indian independence, and how inspiring those stories were. Why? Because I had to compete for a scholarship since my parents couldn't afford it. And there was a foundation set up by the Tata companies. And as part of the competition to get the scholarship, I got to read the biography of the founder of these companies, Jamshedji Tata. And that inspired me. I did win the scholarship, and that I think is an act of good fortune more than anything else, because there were so many people competing, and just if I had lost 1 or 2 marks here, I might not have gotten it. But having gotten it, I decided that I wanted to be like Jamshedji Tata, started 5 ventures, and over the last 20 years have been studying what should we be teaching? What is learnable from the experiences of these entrepreneurs who have actually shaped the world? But basically people who have spent all their lives starting and running companies, the simplest definition of entrepreneurship. And it turns out that a lot of what they do is not just starting a company or making a lot of money or any of the things that you normally hear in the press. In fact, there is a story in the press, and the story that we used to teach a lot, like the standard story, that we call the causal view or the causal idea of building successful ventures, right? And the story goes as follows. You come up with a brilliant idea, you go out and do some market research and predict that there is a large market for it. Then you forecast some, how much money you need and what resources you need and who has those resources. And you show them, you kind of convince them that they can make a lot of money, get a good return, and then you raise the money and you start the company. This is kind of the standard model of how people are supposed to build ventures. But when you go and study the stories of these entrepreneurs who have done it over and over again for years and years, it turns out almost the inverse of the story is what is actually happening. So think about this. Why is the causal model, the standard model, what it is? The idea there is entrepreneurs deal with uncertainty. They take risks. So this is the idea. Because the future is unpredictable. So these people must have figured out some way to predict the future better than anybody else, right? But in actual fact, when you go and look at the entrepreneurs' lives and look at the data in great depth, as we have been doing over the last 20 years, we find that these entrepreneurs take a different view. They say, the future is fundamentally unpredictable, so don't try to predict it. Right? Why are you trying to get better and better at predicting a future? Because it is still, fundamentally unpredictable. So they basically have learned, and in some cases invented, and they have come up with ways to deal with an unpredictable future without trying to predict it. And so, as a summary of how they do that, we discovered 5 different principles, and all of these principles have the same non-predictive logic. So the idea here is the reason you predict the future is because prediction can give you some control over the future, right? If you give up prediction, what do? How do you get control? Well, you turn control itself into a strategy. So what you do is you're always thinking about what's within my control, what's outside my control, and you ask yourself, what can I do with things within my control? And who else wants to work with me, and what do they have within their control? And together, we end up shaping and co-creating the future so we don't have to predict it. So you're always keeping things within your control. You've turned control into a strategy. So I'm going to show you just one slide, like the animation of a process of how these 5 principles work in building new futures for us. So here goes. So here's the first principle, the bird in hand principle. You just start with, who am I, what do I know, and whom do I know? You don't even have to consider resources or money or anything at this point in time. You're just starting with these three sets of means. And you say, given who I am, what I know, and whom I know, what kinds of things can I do? And again, because most entrepreneurs don't have access to large resources, a lot of money or investors or anything, you're just actually asking yourself, not about expected return, but you're saying, what kinds of things can I do for affordable loss? So as you can see, this principle allows you to keep the downside within your control, but also makes you think about the upside very differently, right? You start thinking, do I want to do this even if I lose some of the time and effort and emotion and maybe a little bit of money that I'm going to put into the venture? So I call this day one, right? So you can do this, you can start tonight and you can do this assessment for yourself. What do you do day two? Day two, you start talking to people. You start interacting with people. But since the effectual way is not to try to predict the future, you're not just gathering information and advice and feedback. You're not asking customers, what will you buy, right? Instead, you're actually trying to get everybody you talk to, you're asking them to become like a partner of some kind, to make some commitments to your venture. So whoever wants to work with you and actually put some real skin in the game, you tend to work with them. Now, you have the choice of always saying no, just as they have the choice of saying no. But the idea here is you don't have a clear idea, and you're not targeting somebody and trying to convince them. You're talking to anybody and everybody and allowing people to self-select into the process, partly on your terms and partly on their terms. And every single time somebody actually makes a commitment, you get some new means. You not only get new means, you actually set in motion this cycle, an expanding cycle, because now it becomes not just who I am, but who we are, right? So because this is a partnering relationship, because in the early stages, you don't have anything particular that you can sell or that you can pitch, that you only have an idea, sometimes only a gleam in the eye. But depending on who is coming on board, you can start fashioning the vision, fashioning the product. Everything starts getting co-created. So you kickstart this cycle of an expanding set of resources, but good people who want to work with you they're not just followers. They're not just going to work on things that you want to work on, right? So they come in because they want to shape the vision as well. So some of your goals also starts getting rearranged in this process. And that's set up like a converging cycle that affects what you can and cannot do, or rather what we can and cannot do in this process. But at the same time, while we are doing all these things within our control, the world is still out there, and it can kick you every once in a while, right? It just throws stuff at you that can be positive or negative, and you have to think about how do you incorporate that into this. And again, you do it with the stakeholders. So the idea here is things outside your control can influence your bird in hand and your affordable loss. But now if you look at it, the process itself leads to something. It converges into something. That could be a new venture, a new product. It could be a new market. It could be a whole new future here. And the beauty of this process, and here is where a lot of people always ask me, they look at this diagram and say, are you saying that if I do things effectually, I will be successful? And I tell them that would go against everything I've been talking about, because the whole idea is it's not about predicting whether you will succeed or not, right? But here are a couple of predictions. Now I mean predictions in the scientific sense that comes out of this model just by using logic. Take a look at it. Just because of the process, the way it works, if you succeed, remember I'm not telling you your probability of success goes up. If you succeed, the probability that you're going to end up with something new goes up, right? And hopefully with innovation, the magnitude of the success can be higher. Similarly, on the downside, if you fail, then no one loses more than they can afford to lose in this process, right? So each person is trying to keep their downside within their control. And that is the beauty of this idea, that it's not about whether you succeed or not. it really gets you to think about success and failure in a very different way. It allows you to think about what is worth failing for in some ways, but it also allows other people to come and shape innovation and get you to do things. Nobody in this process has to be a genius. The process itself can get you to innovation. So given our studies on this over the last 20 years, one of the things that we started realizing is this is not about just starting a company, right? This is a method for us to deal with the world of people in particular. And so we've been thinking about this as a method to create new futures, to tackle existential problems that humanity faces and things like that. So people have done a lot of work on showing how this process works, say in tackling poverty or climate change or creating art and things like that. So the idea here is anybody can use this method and that we should be teaching it to everyone the way we teach science. It is not only about teaching potential entrepreneurs. But the most important thing I want to leave you with today is if you have some kind of an aspiration, whether it is to start a company and make a lot of money or start a nonprofit or figure out some ways to solve big problems in the world or to create some value within the companies that you're working for or even within the government or the public sector in some ways, no matter what you think about it, there are two things I want you to remember. One, it is a method. It can be used for good or for bad. But the more number of us who actually use it to achieve our aspirations to live in a better world, we can actually construct better worlds. And that is the message from this. So if you have an idea, if you have an aspiration of any kind, to make your life better, the lives of your loved ones better, or your community or your country, I would say this model tells you you don't need to wait, right? You cannot tell me you don't need to wait for a brilliant idea. You don't need to wait for resources. You don't need to prove to yourself or to anybody that you will succeed. You can get started tonight, just with who you are, what you know, and whom you know. Thank you.
So we have time for a few questions if someone wants to reflect or ask Saras something. I'll take that one.
Thank you. That was very inspiring. So this is sort of how we do science as well, to a large degree, right? Particularly when we work in collaborative structures, like, for example, observational astronomers often do. But I was wondering a bit, so this seems like a dream machine, right? We follow this and all will be well. But what happens? Could it go wrong? Could it be corrupted in a way? And what would the outcome be? Or is it an uncorruptible machine?
So I'm very glad you asked the question. And there are so many ways I would like to go on the answer. But the simplest way is your analogy to science is absolutely on the money. Can we go wrong with science? Have we gone wrong with science? Oh, well, Putin is knocking, isn't he? So when we think about it, of course it's a method. Of course, it is not a dream machine. It is a machine to achieve your dreams for sure, but it doesn't tell you about what dreams you should be dreaming, right? In fact, when we first when the paper came out that Hendrik said, one of the very first calls we got was from the Department of Defense. You can imagine, the paper came out in 2001, and the Department of Defense in the US was saying, we train our military in a 100% causal way, and the terrorists are effectual. So the first great example of effectual entrepreneurship outside of entrepreneurship that came knocking on my door was terrorists, and they were absolutely correct. So it is a dream machine in the sense in which science is a dream machine, or rather it's a method. And that is why I think the more number of people we educate on this method, At the end of the day, there's only one probability that we all stake our entire existence on, and that is that on an average, most human beings, for the most part, are decent and want to build a better world. We have nothing more than that available to us on the upside, and that is kind of my mission here, so that we give more tools to the people who do want to do good things with it. I hope that answers the question.
One more, or perhaps two? A few questions we have time for. Lotta?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, and congratulations on the honorary role in entrepreneurship here at Chalmers. I was wondering about the research results that may exist. We see that this is teachable. If we apply it in practice, how reputable is it really? Like when we look at the outcomes of the pedagogics that are based on this, as you know them or might have researched yourself? Thank you.
Wonderful question, and it's a very important question, both given the practical aspects of what we are doing, the research aspects of what we are doing, but also the mission that I'm offering to people, right? So we should be, is it teachable? How do we know it is teachable? And then how do we assess? So right away, you will have one problem, right? Whether you're a researcher or an educator. If you're going to teach this way of thinking, and this one is about creating new goals and new futures in some ways. How do you assess? Because we are all very different, and we are all going to come up with different ideas through this process, and what we end up building, and also what we want, right? Some people want to build a company and take it public. Some people just want a nice lifestyle, or they want to do something in the community. So there's so much variation, both inside inputs and outcome, that it is a challenge in some ways. But again, the analogy to science and invention is very useful here, right? So one of the ways you want to think about it is you want to connect the input with the output. So I tell my students, don't worry about, how can I be a successful entrepreneur, or how can I build a successful venture? I actually say, given who you are, what you know and whom you know, what kind of successful ventures can I build is a better question to ask. So what we want to be doing is to think about matching up people. So in science and invention, what do we do? When we teach a course, we don't assess people by whether they actually, became scientists or invented something or won the Nobel Prize, right? And so we don't want those kinds of assessments. So the assessment challenge is really to think about how do we connect what we are teaching, which is the process, but assess in terms of the match between what's coming in and what's going out. So one of the things I do is I tell my students, we are also going to teach effectually. So the student gets some input on how they want to be assessed, and then we come to a negotiation on how I assess. So that's one of the things we do. But the real assessment, if you want, at a higher level, not in terms of individual classrooms or individual students that you're teaching, one of the things you want to do is what I call like a live option. Does the student walk away from the class truly believing that if they need to start a company, if they want to start a company, if they need to solve a problem in the world that involves a lot of other people, do they feel they can do it? So what did they walk into class with on what they thought they could accomplish? And what do they leave with in terms of what they could accomplish? For me, that is the touchstone. And I think that touchstone we can apply at individual levels, at the level of companies and the level of communities as well. But there is work to be done. So if you have ideas on how to do this, please, become part of the community. We are happy to think about it. The work is, it's just beginning, a lot of the assessment work. Yeah.
So I think one more question. Yeah, Anna?
You're going to get for the microphone. Okay, thank you. I'm just wondering about the term effectuation. Has it always been called effectuation from the beginning of your developing your idea?
It's a good question, and it is a thorn in the side in some ways, right? A lot of people tell me, man, this is an ugly word, right? Is this an actual English word? I used to get that. And the Germans absolutely hate it because they believe they can translate every word. They have not been able to translate this one, right? So here are my answers to it. Yes, it is an actual English word, right? And it came from the idea of cause and effect, right? So causal thinking, effectual thinking, causation, effectuation. So in causal thinking, you start with an effect and you figure out how to cause it or what are the causes, you know. Here, you start with causes, means, and you create new effects. It's all about new effects. So that's where the idea for the name came in. And yes, I am the culprit. I came up with it during my PhD because we discovered these 5 heuristics that I now call principles. And I was just thinking, like any other cognitive scientist studying expertise, here are 5 heuristics that these expert entrepreneurs have learned. But I had a wonderful advisor named Herbert Simon. And he said, have you checked whether these principles or these heuristics are logically consistent? And then going back and doing that analysis, it was absolutely logically consistent. They were all non-predictive. So then he gave the advice, because they hang together logically, you should give a name to the whole cluster of heuristics. So, and then there were other people who said, maybe you shouldn't. It seems very pompous for a PhD student to like name a new theory. I mean, so I got all kinds of conflicting advice. But I said, let me come up with it. I'm an entrepreneur, right? I love names. I think branding is important, right? I was like, okay, let me come up with a name and try it out. And I tried to come up with the most logical name, which was the name Effectuation. And even today, a lot of people are like, oh God, this is like a horrible word. And people, Babson, for example, built a lot of curriculum based on it. And they wanted to call it something else. And I'm like, this is a history of ideas. I'm fortunate to be part of a wonderful university system. I don't care if you never use the word effectual or effectuation. I don't have to be an entrepreneur. I can be an academic. So I haven't put all that much work into the branding. But it turned out that this ugly word, precisely because it is ugly, for some reason, is living on its own at this point because people haven't come up with a cool alternative. If you come up with a cool alternative, I'm willing to.
Perhaps choosing a word that no one else wants to use is a good strategy, right? No one's going to steal it or try to...
I wish I had known all that. I was just thinking, you know, cause and effect.
So I think with that, we're finished with this little Q&A, and I'll hand the word over to Stefan, the rector here at Chalmers.
So thank you very much. And Professor Sarasvathy, thank you very much indeed for a very inspiring lecture.
Thank you.
5 principles in a structured way of thinking by which we can increase our ability or the chance that we actually could build a better world. It's fantastic. And I asked my colleagues, do we have a Swedish word covering effectual? We have to think about that. So as president of Chalmers, let me congratulate you to your honorary doctorate, and let me say, welcome in the Chalmers family.
Thank you. I already feel very much at home, actually.
Yeah, it will be a pleasure collaborating with you in the future. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And I think we now have the chance of mingle a bit with some coffee and tea.
Always ready for that. Yeah, yeah.